There's hope electric cars could play a significant role in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but now they account for 0.6% of all new vehicle sales in Canada. That hasn't stopped governments in BC and Ontario and Quebec from offering subsidies for e-vehicle buyers. The Montreal Economic Institute calls those subsidies the most expensive and least effective way to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Germain Belzile is a senior associate researcher at the Montreal Economic Institute. Nice to see you again, sir. Can you just sort of lay out the case for us against these subsidies?
Well, they're hugely expensive, and they change close to nothing, in fact, to the big picture on GHG emissions in Quebec and in Ontario. So they're a waste of taxpayers' money, in fact.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because I think different people would say what its intent is not necessarily just to pull down greenhouse gas emissions, but to sort of change to transition us to cleaner cars. So let's start with that assumption. Do we need, as a society, to be moving towards a world and transitioning towards a world where we use cleaner cars?
We need to be transitioning towards a world in which we emit less GHGs. That they come from cars or from other sources is really rather unimportant.
So whether we're using, then it's not about subsidies, it's about EVs actually don't address the problems that you're trying to tackle in this paper.
Exactly. In fact, we can reduce GHGs through the carbon market right now, and the cost of emitting a ton of GHGs right now is around $18.50 on the carbon market, in which Quebec and California are participating, and Ontario will join soon. And in fact, in Ontario, it costs about $523 per ton to reduce a ton of GHG. So that's 29 times more than on the carbon market. So it's simply not efficient.
Right, and on the subsidy, I sort of get that, but I want to get into the meat of this. You're essentially saying that whether you drive a regular car today or an EV, it has a negligible effect on the environment. Is that the base of the argument here?
Well, it's part of the argument. In fact, when we build an electric car, we emit more GHGs in the making of the car because of the batteries. We get back this gain and more when we drive the car for about 10 years. But when you look at the whole picture over the whole life cycle of the car, and you calculate the number of tons of GHGs not emitted with an electric car, and you compare that to the huge subsidy in Ontario, it's close to $15,000 per car, and $8,600 in Quebec per car. Well, you get to an amount of $288 per ton, and in Quebec, and $523 per ton in Ontario, and that's a very conservative estimate. It takes when we do this calculation, we assume that every purchaser, every buyer of an electric car would not have purchased a car without a subsidy, which is clearly not the case.
So, I mean, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, and I'm imagining somebody from a city that is fighting and in a rough spot with the amount of sort of fumes and exhaust that are in that city. We see that in Paris and in London. We see that in China and a lot of cities where the fumes and exhaust from cars, from traditional cars, is a big part of the issue in those cities. They're saying we need electric cars to clean our air immediately, not on the big scale of sort of greenhouse gas emissions writ large, but on a very micro level, and that they say these subsidies are maybe inefficient, but are what you need to roll a very heavy rock up a very steep hill and get that movement going towards people transitioning to cleaner cars. Does this apply to that, or is this simply on the bigger picture looking at greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, if we're not trying to reduce GHGs, but we're looking for something else, that's a different question. But then we should maybe have more stringent regulations on the emissions of sulfur or other contaminants. But we're talking about CO2 right here. And if you want to reduce CO2, well, this policy of subsidizing electric cars is simply the worst policy that we could imagine.
I want to dig in a little bit to the provincial sort of, goals that they've set, the targets. Quebec wants to have 100,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2020 and 1 million of them by 2030. Is that even remotely realistic at this point? I think it's, 0.6% of cars on the road right now?
Just about. In fact, the goal is 100,000 electric or hybrid vehicles.
Right, fair enough.
In 2020, and 2030 it's 1 million. So right now in Quebec we have a little less than 6,000 electric vehicles, and if you combine electric and hybrid, about 15,000. So we're very, very far from the objective. So in fact, the Quebec government is even planning to implement a regulation, a quota, in fact, on electric and hybrid cars. So manufacturers who don't sell a certain percentage, minimum percentage of electric or hybrid cars will have to pay a fine, and this will certainly be added to the price of a standard car in Quebec. So it's even going to cost more, in fact, to some citizens.
Well, and then you get into, you raised the point about the other sort of motivator here, is a lot of these, the OEMs, the big car manufacturers, are using these subsidies to get more of these electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles out on their lots so they can continue to create and sell those traditional gas-guzzling models. Isn't that true?
That's right. In fact, we have a contradiction in regulations. In the United States and in Canada, we have the CAFE standards, which regulate the average quantity of GHG that must be emitted by a car. So if car makers produce more hybrids and electric cars, well, they reduce their average GHG emissions, which means that they can increase, in fact, their GHG emissions from standard vehicles. And it's probably what they're going to do in part. In fact, they're probably going to start selling standard cars which emit more GHGs because of that. So there's in fact, this is not the first contradiction in these policies.
No, indeed it's not. Listen, we got to leave it there, but it's great to see you as always, Germain. Thanks for this.
Thank you very much.
Germain Belzile, Senior Associate Researcher at the Montreal Economic Institute.